Tonight, I am going to be talking about chapter 25 in the book How to Do Life by Traleg Rinpoche. This particular chapter is titled Happiness and Our Karmic Disposition. And I'm going to start out with a quote that's very close to the beginning of this chapter. If we did not take suffering seriously, happiness would not be an issue. End quote. The point being, in Buddhism, we take suffering seriously because we have to understand it and work with it in order for us to have the experience of happiness besides experience of pleasure, or he used the term elation, and that's very different than happiness. So this chapter is going to go into a little bit about what happiness is and the difference between it and pleasure or enjoyment and elation and so forth. So we attain happiness when we attain enlightenment. And this, of course, would be permanent happiness. We can get experiences of happiness before that, but it's always a glimpse. So we start with understanding suffering, and that suffering is an essential part of the path. Only humans can really understand suffering at a deep enough level to use it in a positive way. We all know that animals experience pain and they have the experience of suffering. And on the other hand, they really don't have the ability to deal with it in a way as positive as humans do. If we're going to understand happiness, not only do we have to understand suffering, but we have to understand what happiness is not. So, elation, pleasure, single experiences of pleasure, drugs, accomplishments, awards, and so forth. None of these are real sources of happiness. They might be sources of, again, elation or pleasure or feeling satisfied, but they're all short lived events, occurrences. They don't last. Happiness, on the other hand, is beyond a one off experience. Happiness, its roots are much deeper than that. And of course, it comes from within rather than things that we have done in the external world. Also, happiness is nourished by wisdom, and wisdom is accomplished by developing an understanding of ourselves, an understanding of the world that we live in, our relationship to the world, our responsibility to the world, and our responsibility to others. You could say it's seeing the bigger picture. So now to develop the self-understanding, Traleg Rinpoche goes into our sensory experiences. This is a little bit repeating what I already said, but pleasant sensory experiences aren't the source of happiness, and unpleasant ones aren't the source of unhappiness. What happens is our sensory experiences are processed by our minds, and then it becomes a complicated, sometimes extremely complicated, psychophysical process. And that kind of has a bad connotation because of the movie Psycho, perhaps. What is meant here by psychophysical is that it is a relationship with our mind and our body and our bodily senses, and it can get very complicated. We cannot have sensory experiences without our mind being involved. That he used the term linear. It's not a linear process. It's not one of the sensory experience of A always leads to the mental experience of B. Sometimes it can lead to C, D, E, or who knows what. We're multifaceted beings, that we have many different parts of us that come out in different situations. And even when we might be in a similar situation, we can react very differently based on any number of factors. Again, we're very complicated psychologically. We use sensory experiences to help shape our identity, shape our sense of self. And this sense of self has an impact on how we see the external world. So again, there's so many different factors that come to play when we are involved with our sensory input. And this sense of self, I'm going to use the term fabricated self. He doesn't use it in this part of the book, but the sense of self is put together from pieces from our experience in the past. And it also can come from habitual patterns, from actions we've done in previous lifetimes. The point is, this fabricated self, this sense of self, is flexible. It's not fixed. We like to think that it's fixed, that there's something solid there, that this is who I am, but it can change, and it does change. And karmic influences from our past lives are not solid either, that they can change. This is an important point, that our minds are very, very flexible, and we just don't want to, you might say, be flexible. We want to have something solid there, that we can define ourselves on this. This is who I am, and it's not going to change. So what makes this fabricated self? It's their physical, mental, and he uses the term lateral factors that influence us. And I use lateral to mean environmental factors, external factors. He also uses the word elements here. I, again, am interpreting his use of elements as the same as factors, that he's not talking about the 5 elements that are used in Tibetan medicine, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. He's talking about factors or elements that come to play in making up this fabricated self. And these elements are internal and they are external. Karma would be an element that is internal. And it is karma that we are born in that comes from our actions in previous lifetimes. So these sensory experiences that we have go through the filter of our karma, our habitual patterns, this sense of self, of this is who I am, the judgments that we have about the surroundings, the external environment that we're in, the judgments we have about other people that are involved in our lives and in this particular situation. We really can't separate all these different factors. It gets too complex to do that. Again, though, just because all of these factors are influencing us, it doesn't mean that we can't change. We can change if we're willing to put the effort into it. You might say, do our homework diligently. It takes time. We have to train ourselves. We have to develop insight. And with that comes clarity. And of course, meditation is a big, important part of this picture. Having a regular meditation practice. And it's so easy to think, well, things are going bad for me right now. I've got to do all these things. I don't have time to practice. It's also easy to think, well, things are going really well for me right now. I don't need to practice, or I will not practice now, but in a month or 6 months or a year, I will do a weekend retreat, or I'll even do a week retreat, da, 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 da. And then, of course, that extended retreat never happens. And even if it does, you're developing a habit of putting things off and then trying to do it all at once. Whereas the The habit that you need to develop is regular practice, doing it whether you're feeling good or feeling bad, feeling up or feeling down, just doing it. Now he goes into desire. He looks at desire, and it's interesting the way he looks at it is a little different than I've heard from other Tibetan teachers. This part is the same all across the board for Buddhism, and that is that we desire far more than we can obtain. Our minds are limitless, therefore our desires can be limitless. But he says that all desire is not bad. What we have to do is be careful and be wise about what we desire. It's excellent to desire enlightenment. It's excellent to desire liberation and to desire to make progress on the path. All of this can lead to putting effort into our practice. So that type of desire is excellent. It's motivating. It encourages us to behave in a very beneficial way. On the other hand, now he talks about struggle. He says that struggle is part of life, that this is the source of many problems in life, that we have inner conflicts, for instance, that comes from wanting an inner ability that we don't have or we are not able to access. So that's one form of struggle. Let's just say you're in a situation socially with another person and they are saying things that you just do not seem to find the right words or the courage or the confidence to be able to work skillfully with the other person. Whatever it is, it could be a work situation, it could be a situation in a relationship, it could be a situation in a store, it could be anywhere, could be a phone call, but you feel that you're inadequate to handle the situation the way you would have liked it to be. Another source of struggle is, of course, that there are too many things in the outer world that we want to achieve. And the struggle is, which do we pursue? Or maybe we pursue too many things, and how do we find time and the resources and the energy to pursue all of these things? Or it could even be, how do I have a fulfilling life? I'm dissatisfied with where I am. I don't know where I want to be. Or should I go this direction or should I go that direction? Do I have the courage to go in a new direction? And on and on and on. It's endless, the kind of inner struggles and outer struggles that we can have in life. The point being is that we need to be aware of these inner conflicts and struggles and work with them skillfully if we're going to have happiness and peace. Again, we are very complex beings. Quote, knowing that we are multidimensional human beings and that the world is also complex will bring some form of simplicity and clarity to our lives, end quote. So the first thing we need to do is become aware of this complexity. And then, of course, by contemplation, insight meditation, shamatha meditation, you might say chewing on it, going over and over in our minds over a long period of time. Gradually, things come into focus. We start seeing things more clearly. This is very beneficial. He talks about one of the problems of samsara and samsaric beings. He says that samsaric desire is monofocal. We are focused on one thing and we miss everything else. When we are monofocal on our desire, samsaric desire, we're cherry pick what we want to see and ignore everything else. And as a result, we end up with our personal version of reality. And it's a distorted version of reality. It's our version, our story. It's not somebody else's version or somebody else's story. So by understanding this distortion brings wisdom, and it reduces bewilderment and ignorance. We do have to be selective and discriminating, but this is very different than denial and blocking experience. These have a very negative effect on our well-being and our happiness. Ignoring things, denial, thinking, well, this is important. I don't have to deal with that now. I'll deal with it later. All of these things. Or this isn't as unpleasant. I can just let it go. All of these things cause problems in the long run, brings up negative emotions and judgments, sometimes of ourselves, sometimes of others, and sometimes both. So we have negative emotions and judgments, and then comes conceptions and more conceptual elaboration, monkey mind, subconscious gossip, and on and on and on, and more stress, more suffering. So if we can work with pain, pleasure on a sensory level, we can develop skill in dealing with it on the suffering level. If we can have sensory experiences without desire, then clarity comes in how we experience it with the senses. And then more clarity comes in discernment about how we add intellectual baggage to our thoughts. We can develop more ability in distinguishing between good desires and bad ones, and we can cultivate the good ones. And by cultivating the good ones, this helps to overcome the bad ones and consequences of cultivating negative desires or harmful desires. And this goes into the appreciation of the simple things in life. Earlier, we talked about simplicity arising as we start understanding things at a deeper level. All of this leads to the appreciation of the simple things in life. I gave this example last Saturday, and I think it bears repeating. When I first moved out here to this place in 1971, very quickly, I had horses and joined a saddle club and would go on trail rides with the club and ride in parades. Would sometimes just ride a horse around by myself, or my former wife and I would ride down to the neighbors after we ate supper and, do all kinds of things to have fun and enjoy the horses. Eventually, I realized that having horses meant you had to go out in the morning and feed and water them and make sure they all were all right. And then if you were a good horse owner, you would check them at night. And they needed veterinary care. They needed their hooves to be trimmed. You had fences to maintain, gates that had to be kept closed. Then there was the horse manure that had to be spread on the fields. They needed hay. You needed to make hay. And then you had to store it in the barn, and on and on and on. And I eventually realized there were easier ways to be happy, that you didn't have to have all this complication to be happy. Then I didn't have any horses after that. So this is what is meant here by appreciating the simple things in life. I took more walks in the woods. It was very easy to take a walk in the woods. Didn't require anything that I didn't have. No preparation, you might say, other than finding the time to do it. And I could find the time to ride a horse. To go on with this, that our relationship between desire and the object of desire, if there was a causal relationship between the desire and the object of desire, we would have the same response every time. But that isn't the case. Economists talk about the law of diminishing returns. What that means is that if you buy something, take your pick, whatever it is, and then let's say a month later you buy another one. The first time you were happy, the second time you're happy, but you might not be quite as happy as you were the first time. And then the third time, you're a little less happy. The fourth time, you're a little less happy. In other words, the more we repeat a certain behavior, we have less satisfaction from fulfilling that desire. And I'm using happiness perhaps in a way that is different than the way Tralik Rinpoche is using happiness, because I'm talking about very temporary happiness. This idea of being satisfied by a particular event and it quickly fades. In a way, you could describe it this way: if you're not happy before you get what you want, you won't be happy long after you get what you want. And you may not even be happy at all. You may immediately just want more. So it's really not this lasting happiness that we're talking about here with this law of diminishing returns. And unchecked desire just leads to disappointment, resentment, anger, this hunger for more, frustration, dissatisfaction. None of it sounds very good. It's all painful and it's harmful because it influences the way we think, and that influences the way we act. By paying attention to our sensory experiences and to how our mind's desire influence the way we process these experiences, we see that there are more ways to work with them than just going on impulse. We can start to see that some desire uplifts us and some takes us downward. And there can be a learning process going on. We can start seeing that there is a road that leads to happiness and there's a road that leads to suffering. We start to see that sometimes we get distracted by sensory pleasure and we get hijacked by this pursuit of pleasure. Here is a quote from the book. It is better to think of Buddhism as a way of life that teaches us how to be a better human being than we will experience. We will experience a sense of pervasive happiness, an overall sense of well-being and satisfaction with life. I think I might have copied this quote incorrectly. Let me try to do this again. It is better to think of Buddhism as a way of life that teaches us how to be a better human being, that we will experience a sense of pervasive happiness and overall sense of well-being and satisfaction with life. That's the end of the quote. Pain or discomfort doesn't mean no happiness. If we're pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, this actually takes us away from happiness. Meditation is a good tool to train us to see that immediate experience doesn't need an immediate response, that there is a space for possibilities to arise, even when it's a particularly painful experience, that we can take a step back and look at things more clearly before we decide on a course of action. And of course, our action in the present determines which direction we're going to go in the future. So it's very, very important to be motivated by more than pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. He then talks about the five skandhas, and these five skandhas, sometimes the term heap is used in place of skandha, the five heaps. The point being that these five skandhas are five parts, and each of these five parts are a collection. It's not just one thing, it's a collection. And a fancy Western term for these five skandhas is psychophysical constituents. What this means is how we develop this sense of self and this combination of mind and body. It is this sense of self and the mental and physical processes that help develop this sense of self. To go through them very briefly, form is the body and the senses of the body, the sense of sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. These are the five senses that bring sensory input. The next skandha is feeling, and that is this input from these five senses of pleasure, pain, or neutral. It's pretty basic at this level. The next is perception, and this is the thought process. Discernment we start realizing what's going on here, the input from our senses. And this happens very, very, very quickly. It isn't a long, drawn out process. The next is mental formation. This is concepts, thoughts, certain predispositions. And again, even at this point, some of these predispositions, thoughts, and concepts can be neutral. They can lead to a positive direction, or it could lead to a negative direction. And they can cause a wide variety of actions of body, speech, and mind. The fifth one is consciousness, the fifth skandha, and that's being aware of the first four skandhas. When your mind becomes aware of what the other four skandhas are sending you. So this is how the self, or the sense of self, is developed. It's a collection of sensory experiences and awareness of what is happening. But of course, it's in a limited, distorted way, because there is a self that is felt as a separate entity that is unchanging, that is experiencing things from the external world that also are separate entities, rather than being in this interdependent relationship. Karmic Rinpoche says we need to retrain these five skandhas if we're going to attain happiness. He talks about two different types of desire here. The first is a terminal desire. This is desire for the objects of desire, wanting to attain enlightenment, wanting to sit down and have a nice meal, and that sort of thing. Then there are instrumental desires, and these are about attaining the means to obtaining the desired object. For instance, practicing daily would be an instrumental desire, because it's a means to attain the object of desire, enlightenment, or going to work so that you can have money to go and buy food for a meal. That's another instrumental desire. He goes on to say that this instrumental desire is thinking that if certain things are obtained or done, one's life will be complete and be fulfilled, that you can get the right job, the right house, the right partner. The terminal desire, you can succeed in the terminal desire. For me, what jumps out is that terminal also is used in terms of like a terminal disease, that you're going to die, but he is not using that sense of the word terminal here. He then goes into hedonistic and non-hedonistic forms of desire. Again, he's showing how complicated our lives are in our way of thinking, or at least the way that most people's lives are. Non-hedonistic desire is sacrificing happiness and doing something like pursuing moral excellence. He talks about people even sacrificing their own lives to save another. He brings this out by saying that we don't have to sacrifice happiness if we're going to lead a moral life, an ethical life. You can lead an ethical life and still be happy, or be happy actually as a result of your ethical behavior. It leads to happiness, not leads you away from happiness. He doesn't talk too much about people that die trying to save the life of another, so I'm not going to say too much about it either. But the point is that you don't have to do that to be happy. He says that in Buddhism, we can pursue desires intelligently and with wisdom, and we can be happy, that we need to balance our tendencies and different aspects, internal aspects, external aspects, in various situations, that we, in a way, need to recognize our diversity, the diversity of the world, and work with that. Again, out of complicated situations comes simplicity. And we can do this because human nature is not fixed. Even though we bring karma with us from previous lifetimes, it's flexible, it's not fixed. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would say that our minds are like Play-Doh. I don't know if you can get Play-Doh anymore, but the point is that we can reshape our minds. They're not made out of stone. The different elements and aspects of our mind and our body have the ability to change. And our psychological and our spiritual aspects are not fixed. All of this can change little by little, slowly over time. Finally, to end this chapter, he sums it up by saying we need to understand how we judge, assert, and evaluate things. We need to manage our sensory input, learn how our senses operate, learn how desire arises, and then learn this relationship between desire, sensory experience, our thoughts, our emotions, and so forth. Get to know this at a very deep level. The more we know, the happier we will be. And again, the happiness is not based on a particular experience. It's more of letting the inherent happiness that is inside all of us be unobscured by temporary factors. So that completes the 25th chapter. The 26th chapter is Happiness, a Comprehensive Perspective on Fulfillment. Here, the approach to happiness includes perceptual, ethical, and transcendental perspectives. Again, it's not about feeling good. It's not about having a perfect sense of fulfillment and so forth. Here he spells out happiness a little bit clearer. Happiness is more a state of being than an experience. The self is not fixed, but it has innate tendencies, capacities, capabilities. And we can learn to encourage the tendencies that are enhancing and build us up, and we can discourage the behavior that puts us downward and demeans us. A sense of, he uses the term agency again, or feeling capable and empowered is very important. A feeling of, I can do this, I want to do this, and I am capable of doing this. It's necessary for change, and this is about changing. He then talks about karma. We have karma from our physical actions that can be implanted in our body, and there is verbal karma, and there is mental karma. We need to work with all of these, by the way, and if we're going to have a happy life, we must have our aspirations to behave ethically coincide with our aspirations to have a happy life, so we don't have this internal conflict and stress. What we experience through our senses is also influenced by karma. And if we can realize this karmic aspect, we can help liberate ourselves from the karma, especially if we can see every action that we engage in as new, rather than seeing it as just another of the same old, and respond to it in the same way, even if we perceive the situation as being very, very similar to what we have experienced in the past. I've heard this a number of times from a number of people in a wide variety of situations. And it is, I married my father, I married my mother, I married my former spouse. Why do I keep being attracted to this type of person? That's part of the problem here, is that people are not perceiving these patterns, and so they keep engaging in the same patterns. Now, there's another type of problem. He calls it discordance. And this happens when there are these inner conflicts present. where there's one part of us that wants to go to the right and another part of us that wants to go to the left, or there's one part that wants to behave ethically and another person that wants to start yelling at the person. So having a sensibility toward ethical conduct can really help. Getting to know yourself, knowing these different aspects, knowing your weaknesses and your strength. All of this is really important. It helps us make wiser decisions. He even says we need to let go of trying to be ethically good and move towards being an ethical being, where instead of wanting to be a good person because this is the way I should be, it's letting go and just being a good person. You kind of move beyond the I've got to do this or else. And this can produce happiness that we can practice to be able to be a better resource for others. We can practice benefiting both ourselves and others. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation. Either I benefit myself or I benefit others. And so I'm going to benefit others, and now I'm going to be suffering a lot because da 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 da. That the two go together. Quote, virtue brings happiness, vice brings misery, and harm to others. If we practice virtue, it benefits ourselves and it benefits others. Obsessiveness, he says, brings harm too. This is just being too centered on a particular obsession, including this obsession to behave in a moralistic fashion. He then says that in the West, some people see emotions as irrational and thought as rational. And so you go with the thoughts, the logic. In Buddhism, emotions and thought are not separate. No matter what we think, we still can do harm to others, that we can use logic to back up emotional responses. And in fact, in science, this is a problem. The scientists get very attached to their version, explanation of why things are, whatever it is their particular specialty is. And then when someone comes up with a better explanation, a better theory, and so forth, they fight it because they are attached to theirs. So being obsessed with negative emotions is worse than being obsessed and attached to positive emotions. It, in his words, causes you to miss, quote, all of the other fantastic opportunities and possibilities, end quote, that you could have experienced. With obsession, you become obsessed with the negativity. You can't put it down. It torments you 24/7. And if you come to examine this, take some time to look into it, you see this is a problem and that it blocks your experience of happiness. So obsession for the positive, for being a moral or a moralistic person is a problem, but it's even more of a problem when you're obsessed with negativity. He then talks about the 6 paramitas, and they all depend on paramita number 2, morality. If you don't have morality, the others of generosity, diligence, patience, meditative concentration, and wisdom, none of them work if you do not have morality. And without morality, you can't have happiness. And he repeats himself here by saying it's fine to think of your own benefit when you are thinking in terms of morality. He says that often people engage in altruism, but it's done for selfish reasons. He also used the term neurotic reasons. And the person will think in their own mind that what they're doing is altruistic towards other people, but they're actually doing it for very selfish reasons, neurotic reasons. It could be to alleviate guilt that they have. It could be to create a better image in the minds of other people or themselves that they really are valuable. Well, underneath they have this terrible inner conflict about feeling that they are worthless, that they're just a terrible person. They've done all kinds of terrible things and yada, yada, yada. And you're trying to, you might say, counteract that negative self-image you have of yourself. So doing things to boost your own happiness when you're behaving in a way of ethical conduct, this is not a problem. He says we need to trust our true nature, which is our Buddha nature, our inherent Buddha nature. Then goes on to talk about individualism in Buddhism. And he does not see a certain type of individualism as being a problem, that in Buddhism, we don't all become enlightened collectively, that we have to work on individuals. And so we can't expect someone else to enlighten us for us. We have to do it ourselves. And that happiness depends on our own actions. Another person can't give us happiness. That we need to genuinely care about ourselves and others. We need to pay attention. We need to cultivate awareness. And we need to be engaged with the world. It doesn't mean dropping out and disappearing. He says it's also good to try to do our best to excel. Striving is not bad or egoic if it is done properly. Going back to morality, behaving ethically is based on being sensitive to other people. It's not rigid, judgmental thinking, moralistic thinking. It's more of a feeling of satisfaction for doing actions of body, speech, and mind that are good and have good results, beneficial results. And thinking that I have done good things rewards our self-esteem, and we need self-esteem, that we need to be happy and recognize that we have a feeling of richness inside of ourselves, towards ourselves. We need to nourish ourselves. So as we are changing ourselves, working with change and transforming ourselves, we'll see that there are activities that we don't like now, but we can learn to enjoy them because there are benefits that come to the engaging in these actions, benefits that we can receive and benefits that others can receive, that we can begin to see the benefit of virtuous behavior. The other side of that is that we can also start to see that the things that we enjoy and like to do that lead us to unhappiness and unpleasant situations, and we start to do less of those things. When happiness is our goal, we can be more accommodating to discomfort and difficulties. And self-acceptance includes all of our different aspects. Through morality, we come to benefit ourselves and others. The question is that in this book, Trungpa Rinpoche recommends staying in the world and working with the world. And Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche has said the best thing you can do is drop out, go to the mountains and meditate. And both are right. Yeshe Gyamtso, the translator, has said this, that if you ask 12 lamas one question, you'll get 13 answers. Both of these responses are right. It depends on the student. And Trungpa Rinpoche gave up his monastic vows, married, and lived in the world, in his own home. He was a wise man because he never had children. I'm just saying that with a smile on my face. Anyway, he taught to his students about remaining in the world, and he appealed to a lot of people with that approach, and it was beneficial. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, I think of him as being kind of like the Marine slogan, which is, we're looking for a few good men. And of course, Rinpoche was looking for a few good women too. And for all of his spiritual attainment and power, he did not have that big a Sangha. He could give a teaching at KTD, the major teaching at KTD, and there might be 60 people in the shrine room. And he was emphasizing 3-year retreat. So this is a difference of approach. Both are good.